The year is November 18th, 2002. The previous day, some relatively unknown Texas company had made a first-person take on the beloved Metroid franchise for the Nintendo GameCube. However, the original team wasn't exactly resting on their laurels for the past 8 years. As a matter of fact, they started working on a Metroid game of their very own. I doubt anyone at the time could have expected the one made by the Metroid team in the classic style would turn out to be the one to more shift the expected tone of a Metroid game, for better or worse. If you're watching this video right now, it means you'd like to know exactly how better or worse, so this is my review of Metroid Fusion for the Game Boy Advance. The gameplay is largely familiar to anyone who's played the previous Metroid titles, especially Super Metroid, but it's not without some pretty big twists on that formula. For starters, rather than being isolated throughout the entire adventure, Samus is now regularly told where to go by an artificial intelligence unit the Galactic Federation had her taking orders from in exchange for the new ship. Consequently, the game can feel a bit more linear than previous games. While it's nowhere near the extreme that Other M would go, where doors would close behind you every other step, being locked into a sector of space until you defeat some kind of boss is the name of the game here. Another big change is the introduction of the X-Parasite, which for the sake of gameplay acts as items and upgrades. Health and ammo can be absorbed from certain types of free-flying parasites by touch, although the ice ones can actually cause you internal damage before you get the Variasuit. This also factors into boss fights, since once they're defeated they reveal a special type of X-Parasite known as an X-Core. They're surrounded by a thorny layer that must be blasted off with missiles while it tries to ram at you. After this, you can absorb the parasite inside, which will net you a significant upgrade such as the Variasuit or the Speed Booster. X-Cores that have beam upgrades will also randomly shoot them at you while you're fighting it. For the most part, Samus gets the usual weapons and items and they function as normal, although her missiles come with a twist this time around. The first upgrade is basically just the Super Missile, but then you gain the ability to freeze enemies with the Ice Missile as well as a charged state to freeze enemies within a localized area known as Diffusion Missiles. The endgame explanation is that for whatever reason the Ice Beam won't work with their suit, so they had to go with the next best thing. Given that the standard combo in Metroid games is an Ice Beam followed by a missile, it seems like they've cut out the middleman here. Another nice touch is that this game introduces the ability to grab onto ledges. If you're anything like me, you'll definitely appreciate the ability if you go back to Super Metroid and try to grab a ledge, only to find yourself just falling into the abyss instead. The free-flying X-Parasites are unique from items in that they don't just stand there waiting for you to absorb them. They'll fly around and may materialize into an enemy you destroyed, or even fly into another enemy to merge and become a bigger threat, which can lead to a lot of interesting situations. You know, like space pirate mermaids. That's a real thing that can happen in this game. I would say kill it with fire, but they're underwater, so missiles will have to do. The bosses are all varied enough in their style of attack that each one will still present an interesting challenge in their own right, to an extent. This all comes to a head with a giant Omega Metroid that can claw right through you if you allow it to. Thankfully, like with Metroid Other M, Fusion opens all of its doors right near the end in case you are missing any upgrades among them, or you just feel like looking around with those sectors with your new toys. All in all, the game's mechanics handle exactly as you'd expect from a 2D Metroid game. If you can handle an abundance of dialogue and some degree of linearity, the meat of the game itself is just as fun as it's ever been. As of the time of this recording, Metroid Fusion is chronologically the last game in the series, being the sequel to Super Metroid. This could be because Ridley's deader than dead and the space pirates seem to be wiped out along with him. Aside from X imitations of them you'll run along into the ship from time to time. The game starts out with Samus escorting a survey crew from the Federation's biolabs onto the surface of planet SR388, once the origin site of Metroids, until Samus exterminated all of them in Metroid 2 to prevent them from ever falling into the wrong hands. As you may expect, disaster quickly strikes. A particularly aggressive Hornode appears and Samus promptly shoots it down. It's very soon revealed that the creature was a parasitic organism that absorbed the Hornode and took on its appearance. Completely immune to Samus's blasts, it absorbs itself into a Variasuit as well as her own skin. Samus doesn't realize the peril she's in until she's returning in her ship and the parasite causes her to lose consciousness as the ship flies straight into an asteroid belt. This is why you shouldn't drive while under the influence of dangerous space parasites. It's always a recipe for disaster. Her ship is completely destroyed, but Samus is spared by the ship's escape pod, which the Galactic Federation recovers and takes her into a medical bay. Being unconscious, Samus' suit couldn't be removed, so they resorted to cutting up portions of it in an attempt to get at the parasite. However, the outlook for Samus is bleak as the parasite is embedded into her nervous system. Just when they were about ready to give up, someone had this crazy idea of injecting Metroid DNA straight into Samus. Amazingly, this seemingly random idea worked perfectly with the parasite being completely obliterated. The Metroid universe also seems to operate on Bioshock logic because the DNA embeds itself with Samus' own DNA, now permanently making her part Metroid in addition to both part Chozo and of course mostly human. After making a recovery, Samus is then tasked to the research station where the infected pieces of her suit were sent in for study. As aforementioned before, she's forced to follow the orders of an AI in exchange for a ship the Federation gave her to replace the one that was destroyed in the asteroid belt. Samus soon learns that due to the change in her DNA, she can freely absorb the parasitic creatures known as X. This gives her a distinct advantage over them so long as they're in their true form. The problem is that due to her suit being so cut up, she's in her most basic state, in the equivalent of her power suit and just with a regular beam weapon to go by. Due to this, and presumably the Metroid DNA, she is vulnerable to extreme temperatures. This will become immediately apparent should the player decide to check out the freezer that Ridley's corpse is being stored in, as she takes ongoing damage until you leave. The AI then informs Samus of efforts to restore her equipment through periodic upgrades. Somehow, they're able to download the data of equipment straight into her suit. This would suggest that the Federation not only has reverse engineered her equipment well enough to send them to her, but that their networks are capable of transmitting physical objects. It's not like teleporting matter isn't a thing in sci-fi mediums, notably Star Trek, so it's easily believable. After receiving the missile upgrade and then recovering the Morph Ball upgrade from an X-Core, Samus is sent to Sector 1 to deal with the situation down there, but as she goes down the elevator, something much worse presents itself. An X-Parasite, using the infected parts of Samus' suit, has formed essentially Samus at her strongest possible level, known as SAX. Obviously short for Samus Aran X. Given that SAX is basically in-game Samus and you're basically Samus barely beginning a Metroid game, you might not want to fight her. She may actually be stronger than in-game Samus because you can't even harm her at this point in the game. The crafty blob will even use her own anti-Metroid tactic against you by putting you on ice, followed up by a missile up your frozen rear end. So basically SAX is bad news all around. As the game goes on, however, Samus systematically gains more and more abilities while dealing with issues in certain sectors and gaining more access to the ship via unlocking security clearances. The obvious side effect is that whenever you open up an area, it becomes open for the X-Parasites, including the SAX. Because of this, you spend essentially the entire game playing catch-up with them. Fortunately, after acquiring the various suit upgrades, Samus is no longer vulnerable to extreme temperature and actually gains more health from blue parasites, presumably because they're larger size. One funny thing is that right after you get it, they don't realize that you're now immune to them and they'll actually start dive-bombing you again. After realizing that doesn't work, they start running for the hills the second they spot you. Of course, you can still stun them with your beam, and let's just say revenge is a dish best served cold. This also makes dealing with the SAX a bit easier since it can no longer freeze you in your tracks, but the combination of the plasma beam and wave beam is still enough to easily kill you in a direct confrontation. At this point in the game, the boiler in Sector 2 is tampered with and Samus must quickly reach its main computer before the entire station explodes. When she gets there, she has to deal with an X in the form of a scientist. This marks what is perhaps the first and only time Samus has used her weapons to slaughter what is generically a human, albeit a parasitic imitation of one. Probably a good thing the game is 16-bit, huh? Wouldn't want a realistic depiction of a human getting shot to shreds and then transmuting into a giant blob creature. This is Metroid, not Resident Evil. Of course, it's also here that Samus realizes that the X can use their victims as memories and thoughts against them. This sort of foreshadows the true danger of the SAX beyond just having Samus' best stuff. After freeing the critters she first interacted with on Zebes and Super Metroid, there's a power outage and Samus is forced to activate auxiliary power. Although doing this restores the ability to save, thankfully, the power is still mostly out and Samus has to deal with plants that are choking the main reactor. Along the way, you run into SAX again and you have no choice but to cross her gaze, resulting in an escape sequence. Thankfully, you have the various suit to avoid being frozen and ice missiles to freeze her, so getting away is pretty feasible. After obliterating the plant creature and acquiring the plasma beam, this is where I'd say the game turns around from stacked odds of survival into a situation where Samus can actually fight back. The game really hammers us home when in the very next screen you face more of those flying insects, but your beam suddenly makes confetti out of them with very little effort. It's also implied that the plasma beam can harm the SAX, but you'll never actually find out until the finale fight with her, so it's a moot point. Furthermore, if it wasn't already obvious that the AI was conspiring with the Federation to keep information from Samus, it probably is now. It doesn't seem especially pleased that Samus acquired the plasma beam without being intentionally giving it through an upgrade station, of which it never would have intended to give her in the first place. Nevertheless, the AI shrugs it off, tries to convince Samus the SAX is still somehow out of her league, and sends her on her way. After dealing with a rogue monstrous creature known as Nightmare, Samus receives the gravity suit and is once again separated from the AI until she receives the diffusion missiles on her own through an upgrade station. Apparently it's one that the AI never intended for her to actually visit. This of course begs the question what it was actually doing there in the first place and why they didn't simply delete the diffusion missile data the second they accidentally sent it. Maybe they got a blue screen of death or something, who knows? Samus is then sent to deal with an intruder in the Nocturnal Sector, which turns out to be the BOX robot she fought earlier, and acquires the wave beam from it. After this, she makes her way into the Forbidden Sector where the Federation was secretly breeding Metroids. Purely for non-military purposes, you see, even though they felt the need to hide them in a forbidden sector. Clearly nothing nefarious going on here. SAX then follows Samus in, apparently filled with a burning hot desire to immediately attack all Metroids it sees. This quite amusingly backfires because all the larva Metroids dive bomb on it and the sector is put into self-destruct mode. Of interest is that the free-floating larva Metroids, while making it harder for you to get out, don't actually attack Samus. I guess they figure being 100th Metroid is close enough and see her as their kin or something. After the AI expresses further displeasure in Samus, Samus is then sent along her way and has to kill a freakazoid parasitic clone of Ridley. The AI eventually decides to just lock her in her room and force her to not destroy the SAX because the Federation in their infinite wisdom thinks they can actually contain the X-Parasite and use it for some kind of military purpose. Nothing nefarious going on here, you see. Thankfully, Samus manages to convince the AI to let her go, apparently by conveniently reactivating the plot-convenient memories of Adam it had in it all along. Seeing as how Samus was thinking about how much the AI reminded her of Adam on an earlier point, it seems a little contrived, but I'll take it. This is also before Other M made some unfortunate implications about Adam, unintentionally in my opinion, but that's a different story. Check out my Other M review if you want to get into that. Samus' initial plan was to self-destruct the ship, but the AI suggests it's a foolish plan and won't do anything but lead to Samus' death. To her surprise, the AI suggests sending the ship on a crash course to SR-388 to completely wipe out the parasites on both the station and the planet. And as a nice little bonus, Samus probably won't die of it either. I guess when it regained Adam's memories, it became capable of disobeying Federation orders, but you know, Adam always was such a little rebellious scamp. As Samus makes her way there, she has one final confrontation with the SAX before it flees with its bobular tail tucked between its legs, allowing her to activate the crash course. It's funny how the game starts and ends with Samus crashing an expensive piece of equipment into a big rock in space. Nice little bookends there. As she's escaping, she's attacked by a huge Omega Metroid, possibly aggroed by the methods the Federation used to evolve it so rapidly. Another possibility is that it sees her as a Metroid like the larvas, but it just wants to assert its dominance or something. Lacking any means of actually harming the Omega Metroid, Samus is inevitably struck down and about to be finished off when the most unlikely of survivors shows up. The SAX actually shows up and tries to fight the Omega Metroid, demonstrating that the Ice Beam and Wave Beam combined can damage its internals, which are still apparently vulnerable to the cold. However, the Omega Metroid proceeds to slash SAX, reducing it to its original form and allowing Samus to absorb it. The result is that Samus gains her original suit colors in the form of the Omega Suit as well as the Ice Beam. After slaughtering the Omega Metroid, Samus escapes in the AI ship, pondering how the Federation will react to them flat out defying them. Samus then wonders to herself how the ship managed to fly out of the Omega Metroid's path, which the AI guessed she must have been thinking about and points out the critters from earlier that were piloting the ship. I guess it was a good idea to save those creatures after all, huh? All in all, I found the story to be fairly enjoyable. While the large amount of dialogue can be jarring to those used to a more isolated experience, which Samus Returns has thankfully shifted back towards, the more atmospheric and creepy tone that gradually shifts into a hopeful one is a very immersive experience. From start to end, it's a very compelling story. Graphically, the game takes a lot of hues from Super Metroid, which would only make sense since it's the previous 2D Metroid before this one. In particular, the SAX bears a striking resemblance to the Super Metroid variant of Samus, while Samus herself looks unique due to the modified fusion suit she's stuck with. The environments have a decent amount of variety and a good amount of atmospheric detail, both in the foreground and background. It's also not uncommon to see the game give some foreshadowing to future events, such as larval creatures that would later become pupae, and then eventually the flying key hunters you're used to if you've ever played Super Metroid. Due to the parasitic nature of things, the game isn't afraid to get a little grotesque in its design sometimes, especially Nightmare's face once you knock off the metallic plate covering it. Halfway into your fight with it, the SAX even mutates in what sort of looks like a Hornoid on steroids. Given that it was a Hornoid when it first infected Samus, it's a nice little callback to that. The music is nice and varied, and in the two cases where you're on a timer, there's even a female voice informing you of how many minutes you have left, which is a really nice touch given that this is the Game Boy Advance. The game can use the music to really build up tension at times, such as the very unsettling music of SAX accompanied by ominous footsteps, or suspenseful piano music in the aftermath of something really intense. One of the designs actually looks a little weird, Ridley's X form. It would seem the X-Parasites weren't quite adept at imitating his form based off the corpse, because he looks a little ridiculous. You actually catch a glimpse of how he's supposed to look right before the battle begins, before his form becomes completely corrupted. Another thing of note is that the Omega Metroid is a lot more menacing than it is in Metroid 2, where it goes from looking like a little dinosaur thing to what looks like a ferocious beast. This kind of design change is actually reflected in Samus Returns for the 3DS, which is a nice touch. One effect I thought was really cool was the refractive effect that appears when you're underwater or when Nightmare's gravity manipulation is in effect. It really gives a nice touch of flair and really captures, if you'll pardon the pun, the gravity of the situation. All in all, Metroid Fusion performs very adequately in its performance. It's of my own personal opinion that Metroid games tend to look very good in their atmosphere and environments regardless of the platform they're on, and Metroid Fusion does not disappoint in this regard. Without a doubt, Metroid Fusion is an interesting little game all in all. I still find it ironic how between it and Metroid Prime, the one that would end up being more faithful to the formula is the first-person one made by the studio from Texas. However, that isn't to say Metroid Fusion isn't quite a good game in its own rights. Far from it, Metroid Fusion is a very good game. The linearity and abundance of text dialogue doesn't really detract from the game, at least not for me, and while the game can be seen as holding your hand at times, the AI never gives you the complete picture and you're often stuck figuring out things for your own, which is exactly how it should be if you ask me. Metroid Fusion probably won't get your fix if you're expecting an isolated Metroid experience with fully open reign, but give it a chance. There's a lot of enjoyment to be had here if you take it on its own merits.